Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 3. You have made it halfway through the class. I know that it is fast and furious, and of course I know this, and I warned you about it at the beginning. And by now, you all know that as well. Some of you are still trying to figure out the rhythm of this thing. I'm getting panicked emails, but it's important that you do the work, and that you do the work on time. So you know that. You know everything that you need to know. The only thing that you need to be mindful of really that's different from here on out is that your concert report is due this coming Friday. So I'm going to tell you right now, don't wait until the last minute to get it done and to turn it in. I have had students that have had issues with computer malfunctions and Wi-Fi malfunctions and power malfunctions and all sorts of things. And you do not want to put your faith and hope in all of that technology when there's a big chunk of points at stake. So my recommendation is make your goal to get this turned in by Thursday. That way you have a day to deal with any issues that could be coming up. So you've known about it, maybe you've thought about it. If you're unclear on if the concert counts or not, basically anything that's not classical or jazz counts. No tribute bands, no DJs. So it's got to be a band, it's got to be musicians, but it's got to be the bands that play the songs. There are a ton. I've gave you a starting point out there to get that done. If you have questions, you're welcome to message me in Canvas and ask. If you do that, please provide a link. There used to be a time teaching this class, I've been teaching it for a long time now, where I pretty much knew most every band and artist and everything that was, going on. Those days are gone. And it's not just because I'm older now, it's also because the music industry has changed so much. We're pretty much at the end of the days where artists will have a successful long career ahead of them. If you look at a lot of the big touring artists right now, they are the older acts. The classic rock stuff, the things that you hear, but right now, and a lot of you can attest to this, is that the differences of the music that you listen to is so varied that there are people in this class right now, those of you hearing my voice, who maybe there's an artist that you know and love that nobody else in the class knows, which is totally fine. And to some people, they think that's really cool. But the problem is that then how is that artist going to maintain a career once they try to carry on? If you don't get that hit song, which is hard to do because there's not radio support anymore, and YouTube can work. I don't know if you know this or not. I haven't gone into this a lot with classes. I won't go into this a ton, but you can buy YouTube views. You can buy Facebook likes. You can buy all of that stuff. So when someone says, oh, I've got 1 million or 2 million views and you've never heard of them and it seems really weird, and maybe you can think of artists in the past that have been in this situation, know that that doesn't necessarily mean that many people watched it. If you Google right now, buy YouTube views, websites will come up. I don't know what the current going rate is. I should have looked that up before I got here, and I'm not going to distract myself from this because my goal is to not make this a 40-minute long video. But if you look that up, you will find that there are prices. You can buy 500 views, 1,000 views, 5,000, 50,000, 500,000, 5 million views. So when you look at someone and go, wow, I don't know how they did it, that could be one way how they did it. And then once you have a high enough amount of views, things will start to aggregate in a different way. It'll show up on people's feeds and all of that. So the system can always be gamed. Back in the context of this class, back in the day, and even up until pretty recent times, radio was the main driver of popular music. There was, underground stuff. There were things that people could hear. You'd go into your favorite record store and the folks in the record store would be playing music and you'd hear it, or maybe they sort of featured certain types of music. You would hear this a lot when I was growing up in the 80s and stuff in the record stores that I worked in and went to, where they had a lot of imports, or they had a lot of like punk and industrial or things like this that you weren't going to find necessarily easy, but you had ways to do that. Well, the good news is that with the internet, with Spotify, YouTube, all that other stuff, you can find almost anything that you want. The problem is there's a zillion people doing it. I don't remember the exact total. I should have looked this up too before making this, but I go off these off the cuff. So the number of videos that are uploaded every day on YouTube is pretty amazing. It's pretty stellar. And in fact, maybe I'll put a quiz question about that in here, which will be weird, except that I'll try to make it really obvious. So it'll be an easy question. But just so that we can get that point across, that there's so many videos coming out. So you combine that with what you need, that people can buy them, it's a totally different game. So anyways, if you're unsure about the artist that you want to watch the concert of, please message me to make sure it's okay. I'll give you a couple bits of advice. I don't necessarily recommend old concerts, say mid-70s, because the production value usually wasn't that high, not a lot to write about. I don't necessarily recommend small clubs. There's a 1,250 word minimum. You want to have enough material to write about, and at least half of your report should be on the concert itself. So if I know there's a Nirvana one that students have used that's out there, that's like an early gig of theirs in a little club. I think it's in Washington. And there's like not much to write about because there's nothing really to see. There's no light show. It's little. There's no projections. There's no, lasers. There's no fire. There's no, whatever's effects going on. If you do things that are more recent, you're going to have more production value in it. It's going to give you more to write about. Also, I would recommend not doing like outdoor daytime concerts. You can. I'm not trying to dissuade you. I'm just saying that if it's outdoors and during the day, again, you're not going to have the production value. There's not a light show. There's not things like that you're going to be able to comment and write about. And I want half of this report to actually be a review of the concert. Okay? So, enough of that. Other than that, you're going to roll through. You're going to have your regular week. You're going to watch this hopefully early. You got your discussion. This assignment is due Thursday at noon. Your discussion post is due Thursday by the end of the day, which gives you enough time to reply. And then all the other stuff is due, including test 2, which will be due on Sunday. And then the next week we'll have test 3. So, I will work as quickly as I can to get the reports graded, but it does add to my load. So, it's not like that's going to get turned around in a day. It takes me a little while. Okay. That's that. Now, my goal is to not go into a ton of detail about what's going to happen this coming week. So let's see what I can do here. Again, quick reminder, we go back to the roots. We went through jazz and we went into, rhythm and blues, which became rock and roll. Rock and roll went away, and then out of rock and roll, by the time you get to the 60s, everything starts to split. And so we're still going to be spending a fair amount of time in the 60s during this week. It'll pop into the 70s. I'm just kind of looking ahead, late 70s and all of that. Really, my goal with the end of the class is, I mentioned this back at the beginning, is to get to at least like MTV and mid 80s. And so next week's video may be a little longer. This one, I think I can pare down. So I don't get super recent because you all know that kind of stuff. And really nothing new has come on the scene musically probably since 1979, which was when rap came out. From that time on, everything has pretty much been combinations of other things. So you have rap and country, and you have, rap and pop and country, which a lot of country nowadays could be argued that, and I'll speak to that a little bit in this video. Okay, so that sort of frames that bigger. In the 60s, things start to fragment, and as I mentioned last week, what happens is you have this sort of through line, rhythm and blues into rock and roll, then it does this, and then it does this, right? So all these genres start to split out. You learned about the British invasion. You learned about America's response to the British invasion and how that was reflected in the music. And what we're going to do this week, and then you learned about folk music, folk rock, and the singer-songwriters. You learned about Bob Dylan. So as I've mentioned, Elvis is the big game changer in the 50s. In the 60s, you have the Beach Boys influencing the Beatles, and the two big game changers in the 60s really are the Beach Boys, the Beatles and Bob Dylan. So those are the two big game changers that took place then, that caused everything to start to span out all over the place. Even when you talk about soul and Motown that you learned about last week, there were influences that came through soul and Motown because of the work that the folk singers and people like Bob Dylan were doing, where they were using their musical voice to comment on what was happening in the world. And we're going to see a lot of that in the 60s as well. So you saw the changes that came about as a result of the civil rights movement, and how that all impacted the music. And that changed the music of Motown, and it changed the music of soul. And it really changed all of popular music between Vietnam, civil rights, all those things that were going on. And that happens still in this week. So this week we got another 5 modules. You're going to learn about psychedelic rock. You're going to learn about country rock and jazz rock, which is one chapter, hard rock and heavy metal, which is a chapter, progressive and glitter rock, which which sometimes is referred to as glam, which is a module. And then you're going to learn about ska and reggae. And if any of you, grew up watching Sesame Street, I don't know if this was still a thing. When I was a kid and Sesame Street was on, they would have the one of these things doesn't belong, one of these things isn't like the other one. And you would have to identify, right, which thing didn't match. Well, ska and reggae is like an interesting one in this because it's very different. It doesn't directly, obviously, come out of the thread. But you'll see where it comes out of, and I'll talk just a tiny bit about it. So psychedelic rock is what it sounds like. Basically what happened in the 60s because of what was going on primarily with Vietnam, but also with psychedelic drugs, with the breakdown in mores, with the explorations into other religions, Eastern religions particularly, with everything that was happening, the protest movement. This genre came out called psychedelic rock. It came out of San Francisco primarily at the start. You'll learn about the first human being in 1967, January. You'll learn about, this is really where we get into the music festivals. So when you learned about Bob Dylan going electric, that was in 65. The Monterey Pop Festival, which is really important. There's an article on that in here. And that's 67. Woodstock is 69. So you're going to learn about that. Then you'll learn about the Isle of Wight and really how we get to the psychedelic scene that starts in San Francisco, that expands out across the whole country. It has a particular, because of proximity, impact on Los Angeles. So like important bands out of San Francisco, particularly, are the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. LA, you get a band called Love. You also get the Doors. And so you're going to learn about all of them. And then you're going to learn about what happens as a result of that. And so I really, again, want you to think about the impacts of these things. Were they good? Were they bad? Were they both? A lot of life isn't just all good or all bad. There's mixes to them, right? And life is complex. And there's beauty in the complexity, but there's also tragedy in the complexity. And, we've seen that a lot through these last 2 years with COVID, right? There's been really, really lousy, horrible things that have happened, really hard things that have happened, but also amazing things that have happened. And that's life. That's just the way life goes all the time. Okay, so you're going to learn about psychedelic rock. So we're going to get a few of these genres where you get rock something. So you learned about folk rock, which is the combination of folk music and rock to create something new. And Bob Dylan really was the guy that started that. Then you're going to learn about, we'll talk about psychedelic rock, psychedelic influences into rock. Then you learn about country rock, which is pretty obvious that it is country music influencing rock artists. Now, if you think back about the foundations of rock and roll at all, you know that country was an influence to even get to rock. Without rock and blues, you don't have rhythm and blues, you don't have rockabilly, you don't have rock and roll. But what happened in the 60s was that there were certain artists, particularly Bob Dylan, yet again, and a guy named Graham Parsons, who were really kind of taken with, hey, let's go back to these roots of country, and let's try to see what we can do with that and to sound more country. And so what makes country rock different than country was that you had rock artists doing country. Now it's interesting nowadays because even country music, if you put on a country station, and my wife loves country music. I love a lot of older country music. There's a little bit of the newer stuff that I like, but so much of the newer stuff is so pop influenced that it almost becomes arguable as to if the separations are even there, certainly with some of those artists. So you're going to learn about country rock and you're going to learn about jazz rock. So country rock is rock artists influenced by country. Jazz rock is rock artists influenced by jazz. And one of the things about jazz musicians, particularly at this time, was that a lot of them were trained. Most rock musicians, I may have mentioned this before, don't know how to read or write music. They don't know any music theory. And it's okay. They don't have to. No one would argue that Jimi Hendrix wasn't one of the greatest musicians of all time, but he couldn't read music. Neither could the Beatles. That's totally fine. So what you had, though, were you had these musicians that were trained in jazz, but they were starting, the rock was more the music of their time, but they were also seeing, hey, there's more money in rock music, there's more audience, more listeners, more sales. And so what you have is you have these rock musicians that are trained, they have the skill set, they have what we call the chops in music, and they start to bring that in and create music. So bands like Chicago and Steely Dan. And then you'll learn about, I have a little bit in the module, it's not in the book, but a little bit in the module on fusion, which is the opposite. It's jazz musicians that are influenced by rock. Miles Davis being really one of the forerunners in this. And so what would that mean? It would mean maybe instead of a swung beat, it's a straight beat. And instead of a stand-up bass, it's an electric bass. Certain different ways that drum beats were played and just the structures of the music. So that's fusion. So you'll learn a little bit about that. It's not in the book, but it's in the module. Then you're going to learn about hard rock and heavy metal. So in the British invasion, you learned about the Beatles, and then you learned about the Rolling Stones, and you also learned about the Who and the Kinks. Well, the Kinks song, You Really Got Me, lays down the musical foundation of hard rock and heavy metal. The idea of being based on a riff instead of a chord progression by using power chords. These aspects became the foundation of both hard rock and heavy metal. And hard rock and heavy metal to me are different. The book separates them, and you can think about that. There are always gray areas. There are bands that maybe sound one way but look the other, and all of that. So you can think about it as you go through that, but you're going to learn about British hard rock and heavy metal, and you're going to learn about American hard rock and heavy metal. And again, these are the foundations of hard rock and heavy metal. This isn't all the way up to now. So the early stuff, you usually had normal or higher pitched vocals, that operatic style that you would get Robert Plant with Led Zeppelin, and then later Rob Halford with Judas Priest and everything. And that was pretty common back in the day. That changed in the 80s. And you'll learn in a later chapter about speed metal with bands like Metallica and Slayer and Megadeth was the other one that I was trying to think for. So that's later, right? That's in the 80s when all that stuff comes out. So you're going to learn about the early stuff, and you're going to learn about Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin is another one of those bands, extremely important, that you could easily do a semester on. One of the things about Led Zeppelin that you have to understand is that unlike a lot of bands, the Stones and the Who and the Kinks, you had these guys that were young. They mostly started off they were playing music, they met, they were friends. Led Zeppelin really was one of the early super groups. So they were all established musicians, especially Jimmy Page and John Bonham, who were session musicians who are out there playing their stuff. And so when you get a combination like that, you get an extremely high level of musicianship. You also get an extremely high level of questionable ethics. So for example, and there's a whole thing on this, I don't really get into it in the class, but if you know the song Dazed and Confused, which you'll hear in here, I think maybe even in the playlist I have the original. They basically kind of stole that song from a guy named Jake Holmes. just claimed it as their own. So if they covered it, if an artist covers a song, which means just to play a song of another artist, that's not a problem. The original artist, the writer artist gets the credit, the writer artist gets the revenue, and that's how that works. But to say it's yours when it's not is plagiarism. And you learned about plagiarism going into this class because it's a big deal in college. Taking material, this is a good thing to keep in mind for your report, that you didn't create and putting it into something and claiming it's yours is plagiarism, which gives you an F and could get you kicked out of college. How do you avoid that? Well, in music, you just say that it's a cover song. You say, hey, we're doing this song by Jake Holmes. You give him the credit, blah, 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 easily done. If you're a student, you got to make sure that when you're quoting things, you put them in quotations and then you cite them either in footnotes or endnotes so that the author gets credit. Or you reword things enough by doing research, that you reword things enough that it becomes a combination that is original, if that makes sense. That's always your goal in college. You get caught plagiarizing and that could be done, because you always hear that joke about, oh, this is going in your permanent record. That will. And it can actually get you kicked out of a class and kicked out of a school. And have I been involved in having to do that? Yeah, I have. And it stinks because I don't like to. Okay, so you'll learn about Led Zeppelin. And to me, Led Zeppelin is the foundation of both hard rock and heavy metal. So you'll learn about the threads as those went. You'll learn about Led Zeppelin leading to Black Sabbath. You'll learn about how that led into bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. Then you also learn in the States. You'll learn about Alice Cooper, and then you'll learn about Van Halen and some other bands. A couple of comments. One thing that's interesting about hard rock and heavy metal is it's really the first time that we go international. So you're going to learn about British bands, but then you're going to learn about bands like AC/DC, which are from Australia by way of Scotland. You're going to learn about the Scorpions, which were from Germany. So it's really one of the first genres that becomes very popular globally, that is created from all around the globe. Okay, does that make sense? And then one other thing. Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen, game changer in guitar work. When you're looking at guitar players that changed the game, you've got Dwayne Eddy, and then you get to Link Wray, who you'll learn about, Link Wray. But then when you get to people like Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton, of course you have the blues artists that came before that. So Lightning Hopkins, B.B. King, game changers, right? Jimi Hendrix, one of the biggest influences and game changers in rock and pop music, without a doubt. And he actually shows up in a couple of different chapters. I think you already learned about him once. Yeah, and then he'll show up again. And after that, Eddie Van Halen changes the sound of hard rock and heavy metal guitar. So 1978 is one of those moments where that's when Van Halen, their first album, comes out. And the You Really Got Me, which was their cover of the Kinks song, just like totally pumped up on adrenaline and testosterone, full of energy. But then the guitar playing, and then his guitar solo Eruption, and I have these in the module, changed the game. It raised the bar for what was expected from guitar players. And you can actually tell, if you listen to other bands that release music, hard rock and heavy metal bands, you can usually tell if it was before or after 1978 because of what Eddie Van Halen brought to the scene. Now, Eddie Van Halen didn't necessarily create any new techniques. He did create some new things sonically with the sound of the guitar. He was an inventor. He had patents. But he took things from the classical world because he was trained in that. He took things from influences like Jeff Beck and Jimi Hendrix, but then he just upped the game totally. So that's a big influence that you will hear about. And then you're going to learn about progressive and glitter rock. Progressive rock. So we've learned about country influencing rock, jazz influencing rock, folk influencing rock, rock turning into hard rock, and then progressive rock, or what is sometimes referred to as art rock, is where you have classical influences coming into rock and roll. Again, largely trained musicians, meaning they could read and write music. They've probably studied classical music. You're going to see a lot more use of keyboards in this, and you're going to see more sophisticated music in terms of the structure of it and in terms of the sounds of it and the orchestration of it. And you're going to learn all about this because the author breaks up, there's 3 styles that you're going to learn about. And then she's going to talk about bands in those different styles. So it's important that you understand how those break down, because if questions come up about that. And then you're going to learn about glitter rock, which is sometimes referred to as glam rock. And glitter or glam is a different thing. It's different than progressive rock. It just happens to be put into the same chapter because they were at the same time, and there's less content on it. But glitter and glam rock was rock that had interesting influences. A lot of the influences either were about city life, sort of the rural city life. So it was influenced by bands like Velvet Underground, who you'll learn about again when we talk about punk, and Lou Reed, who came out of that scene, T-Rex, Roxy Music, and even Elton John. Really, the 2 big bands that or artists that came out of this would be Queen and also David Bowie. So you're going to learn about both of those, Bowie and Queen, and the influences. They were fascinated not just with city life and all of that. They were also fascinated with outer space. And the moon landing was in 1969. And there were a lot of people that were really disenchanted with the way the world was and the way the world seemed to be going at the time. And so there was a certain romanticism of escaping outer space. Although sometimes even in the songs, it wasn't always reflected that way. But there was certainly an awareness of it and a fascination of it. And really up until that time, going to outer space was never even an option. That wasn't even something that could happen. But now it could, right? That was really the first time, that had happened. There was the race between the Russians and the US about that. But that really influenced progressive and glitter rock. And then you're going to learn about ska and reggae, which are totally outside, because ska and reggae come from Jamaica. They are influenced by Caribbean music, which was influenced by music that made its way north by way of the slave trade, that brought rhythms from Africa and rhythms from South America. And there were indigenous folks on the islands, but then it was really kind of taken over by primarily slave population. And interestingly enough, by the time you get into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the way that radio worked, they could actually pick up radio from the South. So you have Jamaica, which is below Cuba, and then you have Cuba, and then you have Florida, is what is it? 90 miles away, I think. And then you're in the South. So the folks in Jamaica could hear the rhythm and blues that was coming out of the South, out of New Orleans, out of other places, and it influenced their music. Jamaica was a pretty poor country, and so there weren't a lot of musicians to start off with, but there were a lot of DJs, and they would play at parties and social functions, and they would play a lot of American music, a lot of rhythm and blues, and those styles evolved. In fact, the first real ska hit, you're going to learn about a guy named Chris Blackwell, who's extremely important. Primarily, he started Island Records, so he really brought a lot of awareness of ska and reggae. And if it wasn't for Chris Blackwell and Eric Clapton, we might not even know who Bob Marley was. But Chris Blackwell got a Jamaican artist by the name of Millie Small to cover a rhythm and blues song that was originally a song called My Girl Lollipop, and they remade it. She called it My Boy Lollipop, and put it out in a ska style, and it became very popular. And then ska developed. There also was became popular, some in the States, very much in England, because there was an expatriate community in England that just ate this stuff up. And ska preceded reggae. So you're going to learn about ska and then how it goes to rocksteady and how it goes to reggae. Reggae was a religious music. It has a lot of religious connections to it because of Rastafarianism. So you'll read about that. So you really can't listen to Bob Marley without understanding that he was a Rastafarian and what that meant to him. That's why he had the dreadlocks. That's where the ganja, the marijuana came in. And it actually had an impact on why he died, because he died of cancer but couldn't get or wouldn't get the treatment that could have saved him. So yeah, there you go. My goal was 30 minutes. I'm hitting the 30-minute mark right now, so I'm pretty close to it. I think I've covered everything that I've needed to cover for the week. Have a great week. If you have questions, message me in Canvas. Do the work. Get it done early. Don't wait till the last minute. Have a great one. Bye.